For 10 years, he brushed off the nightly interruptions, telling himself it was just part of aging. What he didn't realize was that ignoring them wasn't protecting his peace. It was quietly shaping his health, his sleep, and his understanding of his own body. For a long time, the nights did not feel like something worth questioning. Waking once to use the bathroom felt ordinary, almost expected. It happened quietly, without urgency or alarm. He would open his eyes, sit up slowly, and make his way down the familiar path in the dark, careful not to wake anyone else. The interruption was brief, and sleep usually returned without much effort. By morning, it barely registered as something to think about. As the years passed, those nights began to change, though not in any way that demanded immediate attention. Once became twice, occasionally 3 times. Still, it felt manageable. There was no pain, no sharp discomfort, no sudden shift that forced concern. Each trip felt like a small inconvenience rather than a message, and because it happened gradually, it blended into the background of life the same way so many small changes do. He told himself this was simply what aging looked like. Bodies change, sleep changes, nights become lighter. He had heard these things from friends, from casual conversations, from quiet assumptions passed between people who had lived long enough to notice time moving differently. Waking at night no longer felt unusual. It felt shared, almost comforting in its normalcy. The mind has a way of adjusting to repetition. What repeats often enough begins to feel permanent, and what feels permanent stops inviting curiosity. Nighttime bathroom trips became part of the routine, no different from turning off the lights or setting the alarm. They did not feel like interruptions anymore. They felt like steps in a process he had learned to navigate half asleep. There was also a sense of predictability that softened concern. He knew roughly when he would wake. He learned how to move quietly. He learned which floorboard creaked and which didn't. These small adaptations made the nights smoother, less disruptive. And because he adapted so well, there seemed to be little reason to question why adaptation was necessary in the first place. During the day, he felt mostly fine. Tired at times, yes, but not dramatically so. A slower morning here, an afternoon slump there. Nothing that stood out as unusual for someone his age. When fatigue appeared, it was easy to attribute it to busy days, stress, or simply getting older. The nights and days felt disconnected, as though what happened after midnight had no real influence on the hours that followed. Over time, the idea that frequent nighttime trips were normal settled in quietly. It became a belief that did not require evidence. He had lived with it long enough that it felt true, and once something feels true, it rarely gets examined closely. Questioning it would have required effort, attention, and perhaps answers he wasn't sure he wanted. There was comfort in acceptance. Acceptance meant no decisions had to be made. No conversations had to be started. No explanations were needed. The pattern existed, and he adjusted around it. Adjustment felt easier than investigation. What he did not yet realize was how easily routine can disguise communication. The body often speaks softly before it ever speaks loudly, but soft messages are easy to ignore, especially when they arrive without pain or urgency. When something does not interfere dramatically with daily life, it rarely earns serious attention. The nights continued this way for years. Quiet, predictable, accepted. He did not see them as signals. He saw them as features of a life moving forward, not warnings asking to be understood. And because he did not question them, they remained unanswered. At this stage, there was no sense of loss or concern, only familiarity. The nights felt like they belonged to him. even if they were fragmented. He had learned how to live within them, and that felt like enough. It would take time, many years, in fact, before he understood that what feels normal is not always what is harmless. That routines can gently carry messages we don't notice until we finally pause and listen. That pause had not yet come. For now, the interruptions were simply part of the night, and the night, he believed, was something to endure quietly rather than understand. Over time, ignoring the pattern became less about the nights themselves and more about what acknowledging them would require. Each trip to the bathroom carried a quiet discomfort, not physical, but emotional. It was easier to frame it as inconvenience than as information. Easier to joke about getting older than to pause and ask what was really happening. There was embarrassment woven into that choice. Nighttime habits feel private, almost intimate. Talking about them can feel exposing, especially for someone who has spent a lifetime handling things quietly. He didn't want to bring attention to something that felt undignified. He worried about being seen as fragile or needy, even when no one had suggested that at all. There was also a belief, deeply rooted, that some things simply weren't worth mentioning unless they caused real trouble. As long as he could fall back asleep, as long as the morning still came, the interruptions didn't feel serious enough to justify concern. Making a fuss felt unnecessary, almost indulgent. Avoidance often disguises itself as practicality. He told himself he didn't want to overthink his body. He didn't want to chase every small change or turn daily life into a list of symptoms. Paying attention felt like opening a door to worry he didn't need. So he chose not to look too closely, not out of denial, but out of a desire to preserve normalcy. The nights were inconvenient. Yes, but manageable. And manageable felt good enough. What he didn't yet see was how small dismissals, repeated over years, quietly shape the way we live. Choosing not to notice doesn't stop the body from changing. It only delays understanding it. And while the nights continued to pass, the days began to change in ways that were harder to ignore. As the years went on, the nights still felt manageable when taken one at a time. He would wake, move quietly through the dark, return to bed, and tell himself it was no different from any other interruption life brings. What he didn't notice right away was how those small breaks in sleep were stacking up, night after night, until rest itself began to feel thinner. Sleep changed shape. It was no longer something that gathered him up and carried him through the night. It became lighter, more fragile. Falling back asleep took longer. Sometimes his mind stayed alert even after his body had settled. Mornings arrived with a faint heaviness that coffee no longer fully lifted. He didn't describe himself as tired exactly, just slower, less sharp around the edges. During the day, he noticed small shifts. Concentration required more effort. Tasks that once flowed easily now demanded pauses. He misplaced things more often. Names hovered just out of reach. None of this felt alarming on its own. Each change was subtle enough to explain away age, stress, poor sleep the night before. There was always a reasonable answer. What made it harder to see was how gradual the process was. There was no clear before and after, just a steady narrowing of energy. Afternoons felt longer. Evenings arrived sooner than expected. He began planning his days around conserving strength without realizing he was doing so. Mood shifted quietly as well. He was less patient than he used to be. Small irritations lingered longer, not because he was unhappy, but because he was worn down. Broken sleep has a way of dulling resilience. When rest is interrupted repeatedly, the body adapts. But the adaptation comes at a cost. He noticed that social gatherings felt more taxing. Staying engaged required effort he hadn't anticipated. Conversations blurred together more easily. When he returned home, he felt depleted in a way that didn't match the day's activity. Again, nothing dramatic, just a sense that something was always slightly off. The most difficult part was that these changes didn't point clearly to one cause. They felt like a general slowing, a soft fog that settled in without announcement. Because the nighttime trips had become normal, he didn't connect them to the fatigue that followed him through the day. Broken sleep rarely announces itself as a problem. It works quietly, reshaping mood, memory, and motivation a little at a time. And because the body is remarkably good at adjusting, we often don't realize how much we've lost until something changes. For him, the nights still felt like the inconvenience. The days were where the impact showed, and slowly, without intention, his world began to feel smaller. Not because he chose less, but because he had less to give. It would take one calm moment of reflection for him to finally see the pattern clearly. Not a scare, not a diagnosis. Just a pause long enough to ask a different question. The moment that changed his thinking did not arrive with urgency. There was no sharp pain, no frightening interruption, no voice telling him that something was wrong. In fact, that was what made it possible for him to listen. The realization came during a calm stretch of time when nothing demanded his attention except his own thoughts. He was sitting quietly one afternoon, noticing how early the day seemed to be winding down. He hadn't done anything strenuous. The morning had been ordinary, yet his body felt ready to stop, not rest in the satisfying way that follows effort, but in the dull way that comes from being worn thin. That feeling lingered longer than usual, and instead of brushing it aside, he stayed with it. For the first time in a long while, he traced the feeling backward, not just to the previous night, but to the pattern of nights before it. He remembered how often his sleep was broken, how rarely he slept through until morning, how normal those interruptions had become. The thought settled gently but firmly, this isn't just an inconvenience. That shift in perspective mattered. He had always treated the nighttime trips as isolated events, disconnected from the rest of his life. Seeing them as part of a larger pattern changed their meaning. They were no longer interruptions, they were information. Around the same time, a casual conversation reinforced the thought. Someone mentioned how much better they felt after addressing a long-ignored sleep issue. There was no advice given, no warning implied, just an observation shared without weight. But it landed differently than it would have years earlier. He was finally ready to hear it. He realized that he had been measuring his well-being too narrowly. As long as he could get through the day, he assumed everything was acceptable. But getting through is not the same as feeling well. It is not the same as being rested, clear, or steady. What surprised him most was how neutral the realization felt. There was no panic attached to it, no regret, just clarity. He had spent years minimizing something that deserved attention, not because it was dangerous, but because it was affecting his quality of life. That understanding brought relief rather than fear. He wasn't facing a crisis. He was facing a choice. Continue dismissing the pattern or acknowledge it honestly. For the first time, he allowed himself to be curious instead of dismissive. He wondered what his nights might feel like if they were less fragmented, what his days might be like if rest were more complete. These weren't dramatic questions. They were gentle ones, rooted in respect rather than urgency. Seeing the pattern clearly also softened his resistance. Paying attention no longer felt like making a fuss. It felt like listening. The body had been communicating all along. He had simply learned to tune it out. That afternoon did not end with action. There was no immediate decision, no sudden change, but something important had shifted. The pattern had been named internally, even if not yet spoken aloud, and once named, it could no longer be ignored so easily. With that awareness came reflection, not harsh judgment, but honest accounting. Years of dismissal had not caused catastrophe, but they had carried a cost, and understanding that cost became the next step in his story. Looking back over 10 years, he did not see a single mistake or moment of negligence. What he saw instead was a long stretch of quiet compromise. Small decisions made night after night, each one reasonable on its own, each one easy to justify. Together, they formed a pattern that shaped more than his sleep. They shaped how he felt in his body, how he moved through his days, and how much ease he allowed himself. The first cost was subtle fatigue, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that settles in and becomes familiar. He had learned to function within it. He adjusted expectations, paced himself differently, accepted a lower baseline of energy without questioning it. He told himself this was simply part of getting older, and perhaps some of it was, but the fragmentation of his nights had quietly amplified that tiredness, making rest less restorative than it could have been. Over time, that fatigue affected his focus. Mornings felt slower to start. Concentration wavered in ways he hadn't noticed before. Tasks that once felt straightforward now required more effort. None of this was dramatic. There was no single day when he felt unwell enough to stop. But the cumulative effect was real. His days were being shaped by nights that never fully settled. Another cost was patience. Broken sleep has a way of thinning emotional margins. He found himself more easily irritated, less tolerant of small disruptions. He didn't connect this to the nighttime trips at first. He attributed it to stress, to circumstances, to the general weight of life. Only later did he recognize how much uninterrupted rest supports emotional steadiness. There was also a cost to confidence. Repeated awakenings made him feel less anchored in his body. He became more cautious during the day, aware that tiredness could affect balance or reaction time. Again, nothing alarming, just a subtle shift toward guardedness. He planned more carefully. He avoided pushing himself. These adjustments felt prudent, but they were rooted in a body that hadn't been fully restored overnight. Perhaps the most significant cost was the delay in understanding. By dismissing the pattern for so long, he missed the opportunity to see how his body was changing in real time. Patterns reveal themselves through attention. Without that attention, everything remains vague. He lived for years with a sense of something being off, without clarity about why. Importantly, he did not view these years with regret. Regret would have implied that he should have known better. Instead, he felt compassion for the person he had been. Avoidance had felt easier than engagement. Minimizing had felt safer than questioning. Those choices made sense within the context of his life at the time. What mattered now was not assigning blame, but understanding impact. The cost of ignoring wasn't disaster. It was diminished quality, less rest, less ease, less vitality than might have been possible. Recognizing this did not overwhelm him. It grounded him. It made the issue feel worth addressing, not because something terrible had happened, but because something better might still be possible. That perspective reframed the entire experience. 10 years of ignoring had not ruined anything, but they had postponed comfort. They had delayed the chance to live with more steadiness and rest. As he held that realization, another truth became clear. The reason this finally mattered had little to do with symptoms or worry. It had to do with how he wanted to live the years ahead. By the time he reached this point, his thinking had shifted in a quiet but meaningful way. He was no longer focused on what he had ignored or how long he had waited. His attention turned instead to what lay ahead. Aging had slowly taught him that comfort is not something to postpone indefinitely. It is something to protect, especially when it comes quietly and asks only for awareness. The real reason the nighttime trips finally mattered was not fear, it was respect. Respect for his future mornings, respect for his energy, respect for the simple dignity of being well rested enough to enjoy his days without feeling perpetually behind himself. He began to think differently about independence. For years, independence had meant tolerating discomfort without complaint. It had meant adapting silently and not drawing attention to inconvenience. But now, independence took on a new meaning. It meant staying attentive to his body instead of dismissing it. It meant choosing comfort not as indulgence, but as maintenance. There was also a growing awareness of time. Not urgency, but perspective. He understood that the years ahead were not infinite and that waiting another decade to pay attention no longer made sense. Rest was not a luxury for later. It was a foundation for everything else he wanted to keep doing. Walking comfortably, thinking clearly, enjoying conversations, staying present. He noticed that once he allowed himself to care, the subject lost its weight. The nighttime trips became information rather than annoyance, something to observe, understand, and work with rather than tolerate. This shift alone brought relief. The burden had never been the trips themselves, but the constant dismissal of them. What surprised him most was how small the change felt emotionally once he stopped resisting it. There was no sense of defeat, no feeling of having given in. Instead, there was a quiet alignment. His actions began to match what his body had been signaling all along. He also realized that paying attention did not mean obsessing. It meant acknowledging patterns and allowing curiosity instead of judgment. This gentler approach made it easier to stay consistent without pressure. Awareness became part of daily life, not a task to avoid. The deeper truth was simple. He wanted the years ahead to feel steady. He wanted nights that allowed his body to settle and days that didn't begin with exhaustion already in place. That desire was not rooted in fear of illness, but in care for his own comfort and independence. In the end, the reason it finally mattered was not because something was wrong. It mattered because something could be better. And that realization, quiet, unforced, and deeply personal, became enough.